Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today we're talking about seed starting, because with spring just around the corner, now is a perfect time to get seed starting indoors and get a jump start on the season. And starting your garden from scratch by sowing seeds is not only the most cost-effective way to grow a garden, but it's the most rewarding too, because growing something from seed and harvesting that tasty produce that's free from chemicals and pesticides is really a feeling of joy and pride and a real sense of accomplishment that, knowing that you did that and you grew that successfully and you did it without breaking the bank and you were able to grow this healthy organic food and really know where it came from. And that's really what it's all about at the end of the day, is growing something that you love and being able to enjoy it. So let's just dive in a little bit and talk about seed starting, because I was chatting to some gardening or new gardening friends and co-workers not too long ago. And the one thing that kind of came out was the majority of them are scared of seed starting. So I'd really like to know if you're also scared of seed starting. And I know it can be a little intimidating for a lot of people to start a garden from seed, because it might not grow. There's lots of things, like lots of moving parts that you need to think about maybe. But the one thing I will tell you is, if you stick with it, you will succeed, right? It's just like riding a bike, okay? Sometimes things don't quite work out right, but you got to get back on that bike and keep riding. And, failures, plants dying, seeds not germinating, all these things are totally normal when it comes to gardening, and even more so when it comes to seed starting. I mean, I've got a tray of leeks and there's a couple of modules in that tray that never sprouted at all, and that's normal. Seeds, if you look on the packet, have a germination rate on them. So there's a percentage of seeds that will never germinate at all. And a lot of the time, particularly as a new gardener, we feel that these problems are us and something that we've done. But sometimes they're not. So I really want to let you know that it's really okay to, keep trying, and really, we're working with the natural world. And really the only way that you truly fail is not to try, and not to try growing things from seed, or, even growing a garden at all. So when we're thinking about our seedlings and, plants that we're wanting to, grow, how we're caring for those seedlings, early on in their lives is how, it's going to set the tone for how your garden is going to grow for that coming season, right? I guess it's kind of like raising kids or animals, right? How you care for them ultimately is going to dictate how, things occur later on. And caring for seeds is really pretty straightforward if you understand that there's three main things which plants need. Okay, and that's a growing medium, like a seed starting mix, water and light. So that's three things. That doesn't seem so bad, right? There's a lot of benefits to starting gardens from seed, like it is so much cheaper than buying plant starts and seedlings at the nursery. I mean, like, there's a local nursery here in Utah. They're going to be doing this like tomato extravaganza thing in a couple of weeks' time. I say a couple, yeah, probably about 6 weeks' time. And they're charging like $5 a tomato plant. I mean, come on, guys. Like, for less than $5, you can get 25 tomato seeds, if not more in some cases. And, that's a whole lot more plants, right? And it's a lot cheaper. And one of my favourite reasons for starting from seed is that there's just so many varieties that are available to grow. And I mean, you've probably heard before, especially if you're a regular listener, that I'm really into, growing different varieties of things, growing different heirlooms. Like I'm doing this whole, landrace gardening project, and that's very much how we grow. Like we're trying to find the right varieties that grow best for where we're living now. And being able to grow from seed and trying new varieties has just opened up so many opportunities to do that. So let's talk a little bit now about what seeds you can start indoors, because you can't start everything indoors, and there's some seeds that you're going to need to and some that you don't. So for the majority of us, especially those of us that are in the northern hemisphere or in the northern states where it's super chilly, like in Michigan or Maine, somewhere that's kind of cold, you guys have a short growing season, and starting seeds indoors are really going to help your plants have enough time to be able to grow and produce a harvest before the frost arrives. And some plants need to be sown directly outside in their final growing position because they just don't transplant well. And two that come to mind about that are carrots and rutabagas, also known as Swedes to us English people. And they fall into that category because they don't transplant well and their taproots can get easily damaged. So if you try to grow things like carrots and transplant them outside, then more often than not you end up with failed growth and the seedlings dying off because that taproot gets damaged and they can't grow. So you might see a phrase on your seed packet like direct sow outdoors, and that means that you've got to sow the seeds straight into the garden bed where they're going to grow. But typically plants that can be started indoors are things like your tomatoes, peppers, onions, cabbage, broccoli, loofah gourds, eggplant, tomatillos, leeks, things that have a long growing season or need warmer weather. Those are typically things that like to be started indoors. And usually seeds are sown a few weeks before your last frost date in spring. So for example, tomatoes are like 4 or 6 to 8 weeks before your last average frost. And if you've got in a cooler, shorter season area, then you'd be looking at starting them, around that 8-week mark before your last frost. But one thing that I will tell you is read your seed packet. So if you're buying your seeds from a reputable supplier, most of them have just about everything you need to know about starting your seeds detailed on the seed packet, which is great because, I don't always have access to the internet when I'm elbow deep in dirt outside, and I don't really want to be touching my phone either. So I look at the seed packet for how to be sowing a lot of these seeds. And, the majority of the time, information on your seed packet includes things like when to start your seed indoors, the proper planting depth or sowing depth, the spacing that you need on your plants, the number of days to germination and the ideal germination temperature. So there's a lot of information on a seed packet, yet not a lot of us really read them. And most seed packets are going to tell you if you can get a head start by sowing your seed indoors and when you can be transplanting them outside. So for example, I'm looking at a cabbage seed packet, and it tells me that I can actually transplant that plant 3 weeks before the last frost date, and I can be starting them a lot sooner than that indoors to start getting a decent amount of growth on there, and then I can start the next process of acclimatizing them. And you need to pay attention if there's specific instructions about if you need to cover or not cover the seeds with soil. So for example, peppers don't do very well if the seeds are covered. They like to have a lot of light on their seedlings because that triggers their germination. So make sure you read those and pay attention to it, because when you are going to be sowing your seed, you want to make sure that you're going to get the best, bang for your buck, really. I mean, you've paid for this packet of seeds. Let's make sure that they're going to germinate. So follow the instructions that are on there. It is always going to be in that seed supplier's best interest to give you the right instructions for that plant to grow, because then you're going to come back year after year and keep buying seeds from them, because you're going to build that trust that that seed supplier and that seed is good and it's going to continually grow for you. So really pay attention to the seed packet. And you want to sow your seeds into containers following the directions on the seed packet. And you might need to look at adding a couple of things here and there, maybe tweaking how you're going to be sowing your plants. So maybe if you're sowing things into a container, you want to plant all the same types of plants into one container, because then it's a bit easier to take care of it all. So I learned one year when I was growing cabbages in one half of a 72 cell seed flat, and then on the other side I had tomatoes and peppers, and they had totally different requirements when it came to lighting and water. And what happened was the brassicas, because they germinated so much quicker, they needed a lot more light, they needed it lower, they grew very quickly, and I was needing to transplant them. And it was actually kind of difficult to take out those seedlings without kind of knocking out the other peppers and the tomatoes that were just trying to get established. So I ended up ruining a bunch of seedlings that I'd just started because I was trying to dig out these cabbages. So try to kind of keep plant families together, and it'll be a lot easier for you in the long run. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the growing medium, and one of the best pieces of advice I can give you when it comes to starting seeds is to invest in a good quality seed starting mix. And I get it, right? Sometimes we're in a rush and we just need to grab what's available at the big box store. Believe me, I get it. I do it all the time. And I really like to use the Jiffy natural and organic OMRI listed seed starting mix, because it's available in almost all of the big box stores right near where I live. And I really love it because it's not too expensive. It's really affordable, but because it's OMRI listed, it means that it's suitable for organic growing. And I know that it doesn't have a ton of dodgy chemicals and stuff and chemical fertilizers that have been added to them. And believe me, I've spent a long time in a big box store reading label by label different seed starting mixes, different potting soils, different garden amendments, the whole lot. And that one I use quite a lot, and I trust to help give me a good, strong, healthy seedling. I don't love that it is peat based. So if you are trying to grow a garden and avoid peat, then this Jiffy natural and organic seed starting mix is not going to be for you, because it does contain peat, and peat is a natural resource that's being, heavily harvested, we'll say, and it actually acts as a carbon lock, and it keeps a lot of carbon out from being in the atmosphere. And it's a natural resource that is disappearing slowly. So if a lot of people are wanting to use more like coconut coir or coconut fiber, so if that is you, then try and have a look for coconut fiber. Sometimes you can find it if you're lucky in big box stores, but more often than not you'll need to order that online. So that's just something to bear in mind. And it is really best to use a new seed starting mix for each season, okay? If you're going to use old potting mix, or you're going to mix up the leftover seed starting mix from seed trays, I know because I've done both. I did both because I was, kind of broke and didn't have a lot of money, and I thought, well, let's see how this is going to go and try and use up what we've got kind of left over, and reuse the stuff out of some seed trays and some plant pots and stuff, and yeah, that'll be fine, right? Wrong. And what ended up happening was I introduced a bunch of diseases. So my seedlings all had damping off, which is a fungal disease, and they all keeled over and died. So I resowed them all again, and they all keeled over and died. And I wasted all those seeds in the, less than $10 it would have cost me to go get some brand new seed starting mix. So I don't want you to make the same mistake that I did. Use new seed starting mix each season, and you're going to be so much better off for doing it, because your seedlings are going to be healthier, and ultimately you're going to end up setting not only your seedlings up for success, but also it's going to be easier on your wallet too, because you're not going to be losing seedlings and then having to resow, and then you need to buy more seeds, and seeds can start to add up if you've got a bit of a seed hoarding problem. I mean, seed saving and seed banking problem like I do. So use a new seed starting mix, and that's going to help ensure healthy seedlings moving on. And one of the good things about getting these seed starting mixes is you can tweak them a little bit to how you want to grow. So I tend to add in a handful of worm castings to just kind of give things a little bit of an extra boost. Not necessarily for nutrients, but worm castings have got different microorganisms in there that can really help my seedlings get established a bit quicker. So I like to do that. And the best way I incorporate all that is to mix everything up into a clean bucket, or I use a tub truck. I love those things because they're so versatile. But I pre-moisten the seed starting mix before filling any of my containers, because that's going to make sure that the seeds stick and they're not going to run off. Because if you don't pre-moisten your seed starting mix, particularly ones that contain like a lot of coconut fibre or even peat, they don't take on the water, so you'll just kind of water your tray, and then your seedlings get carried off by the water as it runs off your tray and out into the big wide world. So pre-moisten your seed starting mix, and you just do that by dumping everything into a bucket, and then I add like a cup of water at a time, and then mix everything up with like a little trowel or on my hands. So I just mix everything up, and what you want is your seed starting mix to feel like a damp, well wrung out sponge or a well wrung out dishcloth. It doesn't want to be like soupy, soggy, totally waterlogged, but it just wants to be, damp. And there's lots of things available now, so if you don't feel like you want to be really dealing with all of that, having to pre-moisten a growing medium and maybe adding some other stuff to it, then there's these like compressed discs and you can get them that are just peat, or you can get coconut fibre, and they're basically like compressed, and you add water to them and they swell up. And if you were like growing up in the late 80s, early 90s, you might remember that it's somewhat reminiscent of like compressed flannels, like face washcloths and stuff. Used to come in like these weird compressed discs, and I remember them because they were Disney ones, and my sister had Ariel and I had Eeyore. And you put them into a basin full of water, and this little disc like swelled up, and then there was your washcloth ready to go, which was like super mind-blowing for somebody under the age of 5. And it was pretty cool to watch. So these little discs remind me a lot of that. I'm probably showing my age at this point, but they take a lot of water to fully swell up, and you need to make sure that the disc and the material inside them is moist all the way through, because it's got to work from the outside all the way in. So sometimes the inside can be a little bit dry, but that's a really easy way to just kind of flood it with water, leave it for an hour, and come back and check it, and then add a little bit more water as needed to help make sure those discs are wet all the way through. And they're pretty neat because they're like this easy to move, handy little portable container that's going to be easy to transplant later. And you can get those in big box stores too. They're really readily available, which is pretty neat, right? For, us folks that are trying to grow a garden in suburbia, right? You want things that are easy, and those things are pretty easy. I have used them. I've found them that they're much better for growing things like brassicas, like cabbage, cauliflower, kale, those kind of things. They're a little bit of hit and miss for me when it comes to growing tomatoes and peppers, so I don't use them for that. But, if I'm going to do like some cool weather crops and stuff, then sure, those things are pretty easy to manage, especially when there's a lot of other things going on. And, if you've got kids too, they can be quite interesting for them to be able to grow plants too, because they're easy to handle. So once you've kind of figured out what it is that you're going to be using to grow your plants into, then your mind might think next to, well, what am I going to put this seed starting mix in? If you're using those Jiffy peat pellet discs or the coconut fiber discs, then usually they come with a greenhouse kit, so that makes things a little bit easier. But really, when it comes to containers, you're looking for something that's going to be able to hold that seed starting mix, or that growing medium. It needs to be able to drain water so your seedlings are not constantly waterlogged. And containers for seed starting really vary. I mean, you can use old yogurt pots or cups, all the way through to actually buying seed trays or those little greenhouse kits. Now, I use module seed trays that have anywhere from 36 to 72 individual cells, and I tend to sow like a single seed in each module because it's just easy for me. I know how many I've got in there. I can work out how well things are germinating, and it gives plants enough airflow around them, so I don't have as much trouble with diseases and stuff building up on there. And I like the fact that I can reuse them year after year, particularly if you take good care of them. They can last you for a number of good years. And with plastic module trays and greenhouse kits, you'll just need to wash them with some hot soapy water to remove any buildup that's on them, and that's going to help set your seedlings up for the next year. You can also use things that are biodegradable. So in England, there was these things called cow pots that were made from dried cow manure. Over here in the US, you can get biodegradable peat pots. You can even make your own paper pots. I mean, if you're fancy with the origami, you can make one anyway, but you can actually get a paper pot maker, and they work pretty good. They do have a tendency to dry out, particularly for things like the peat pots, and paper pots can have a nasty habit of disintegrating before they are ready for transplanting. But I've even seen people, and I myself used to save up the old toilet paper inserts to grow things in because they worked really well, and then the cardboard broke down as the season progressed. So there's lots of different things that you can grow plants into, and just get creative and use what works for you and what you have available. As long as it's clean, it can hold some growing medium, and you can put some holes in it at the bottom so water is going to drain out you should be good. And what you want to do is you want to fill your seed starting containers about 3/4 full with the moist seed starting mix. And then you want to gently press out any air pockets. And I mean gently, you don't want to be like smashing it down like with a fist or anything like that. But you're going to be moving out the air pockets, and this is called tamping. It's also known as tamping down or to tamp down the soil. And it helps establish a healthy root system in your seedlings, because if there's air pockets and stuff, then the roots tend to kind of grow and then they'll stop. Whereas if you've got a nice tamped down soil, then you're going to have the roots that are going to be working their way through that before they end up coming straight out of the bottom of that container. So a healthy root system is one of the keys to having really healthy plants. Now, when you start your seeds, it's important to keep the seed starting mix consistently moist. And this is quite important, especially where I live in Utah, because it's dry. But if you're starting seeds indoors, which a lot of us are because it's winter, right? The humidity levels are probably lower in your home than they are outside. So things are going to dry out a bit quicker. And it's okay that your seedlings dry out, but not your seeds. So there's a bit of a distinction there. So when you first sow your seeds, the soil needs to remain being moist, because that's going to help germination. It's going to help that hard seed coating break down a little bit, and then the actual seedling's going to emerge from there. So again, you want moist but not soggy or waterlogged soil. So think that wrung out sponge. If you've got overly wet soil, you are going to end up having some problems with your seeds and the soil. So you can end up with things like mold, algae, or even moss growing on it. I don't know if you've ever been to a garden nursery and you've found like the old neglected, containers that are there, and half of them are kind of filled with moss growing on them. That's what's happening there. You've got very waterlogged soil. There's not a lot of air there, and things are growing which we don't necessarily want to. And if those things are growing on the soil, then your young seedlings, which are pretty susceptible to diseases and problems, they're going to potentially end up contracting some of these diseases and end up dying. So moist but not soggy and waterlogged. And to help germination, you really want to cover your seed starting containers. So if you're using one of those greenhouse kits, they usually come with like a clear plastic dome that you put on top. If you don't have that, then you can use some plastic wrap or something over it. And what this does is it helps keep the soil that's in there and the container and the seeds a little bit warmer. So it's going to encourage that germination quicker, but it also helps keep the moisture in, also helping things germinate quicker. As soon as things germinate, you want to take that dome off, because you need that airflow going around your plants to really, reduce any buildup of disease like damping off. Now, most seeds germinate best when soil temperature is around 65 degrees Fahrenheit to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, or that's 18 Celsius to 24 Celsius. Some plants like it to be a little bit warmer, so some of the hot peppers need warmer than 75 degrees Celsius or 75 degrees Fahrenheit. 24 degrees Celsius. Man, if it's 75 degrees Celsius, that stuff's not gonna it's not gonna grow. It's too hot. But you need to really keep an eye on some of these things, because if you've got these hot weather crops like your peppers and they're not germinating, the most likely reason is because the soil temperature isn't warm enough. And if you've got a cooler home, like I do, most of the time my home's at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a little chilly for a lot of people. I've never used a seed mat until this year. This is the first year where I've really needed them, because my home is a lot cooler and I'm starting my seeds in a basement, which is even colder. And seeds are going to germinate better with some warmer soil temperatures, right? So these are things like tomatoes, peppers. I'm growing bitter melon and gourd this year, and they definitely need those warmer temperatures to germinate. And once seedlings are up and growing, that's great, because I can turn that heat mat off and not worry about it, because once seedlings are there and growing, they actually prefer a slightly cooler soil temperature and good air circulation. So, having a small fan nearby will help keep things moving, keeps your plants a little cooler, and helps discourage diseases like damping off. And if you're using a seed mat, then you are going to find that your seed starting mix or growing medium is actually drying out a bit quicker. So you need to keep an eye on that and make sure that things are staying moist but not waterlogged. And, just kind of keep an eye on how often you need to do that, because it is really going to vary depending on where you are in the country or in the world and what your conditions are like in your home. Now, plants also need light. If you remember at the beginning, I said that there's 3 things that plants need, right, to grow. It's a growing medium like a seed starting mix, water, and light. And for most of us, we've got 3 options when it comes to light. We have a sunny windowsill, we've got grow lights, or we've got greenhouses and cold frames. And I'll be honest, if you have an unheated greenhouse or a cold frame, which, a few of us do, they're not going to cut it for seed starting warm weather crops, right? I was just saying how things like peppers and tomatoes need warmer weather to germinate. So I wouldn't even bother trying to sow seedlings for peppers and tomatoes if you're living in a colder northern state, because it's going to be a waste of your time. Now, somewhere a bit more temperate like the UK, you might actually be able to get things to germinate outside in a greenhouse, because it is a cooler, it's not a as cold a climate as it is in somewhere further north here in the North America. And it's great using an unheated greenhouse or a cold frame to do cooler weather crops. So things like cauliflower, broccoli, those kind of things, they're going to germinate just fine for you in an unheated greenhouse or a cold frame. And the great thing about unheated greenhouses or cold frames, because they're outside, you're going to get plenty of ambient natural light, which is great. Now, for a lot of us, a sunny windowsill is probably going to be our first foray into seed starting indoors. And you should know that a sunny windowsill might not provide enough hours of daylight for your young seedlings. And you're going to need at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight for your seedlings every day. And I use grow lights now, like I've got LED grow lights, but I used to do my seed starting in a south-facing windowsill back in the UK. And some of my seedlings were getting leggy and they were growing like one way. So they all grew towards the light source. And this can happen, and it happens more often than not when you're growing in a windowsill. So I had to combat that by using a piece of foiled covered cardboard that would then reflect some of the light back down onto the seedlings, and that reduced a little bit of that kind of one-way growing and it getting too leggy, but it didn't solve it completely. Now, if your plants are getting leggy, which is where they grow super tall and spindly, then they're straining for more light. It's the plant telling you that it needs more light. And you really want to be putting your seedlings closer to a light source. Now, that's why I really like using grow lights now, because if you're using them, you can put them like an inch or two above the seedling at all times, and that's going to really maximize the amount of rooting, shooting, and growth, and even the warmth as well. Now, I find that even with the grow lights, I have to turn my trays each day, so I've got like even light exposure that's happening for the seedlings that are coming up, because if you don't provide more light, your spindly seedlings are going to be weak. And they're going to be more susceptible to breaking, pests, and even diseases too. So that's just something to be aware of. I think I've talked quite a bit about watering seedlings and how we need to keep them moist but not overly wet. But once your seeds have sprouted, then you're going to need to let the seed starting mix, like on the surface, dry out briefly between the waterings. And this is going to help reduce diseases and encourage strong root growth. And the best way to water your seedlings is from the bottom up. And you can pour like 1/2 inch or 1.5 centimeters of water into a large tray, and then place your trays or containers into the water, and that seed starting mix is going to wick up the water from below, and your plant roots are going to be encouraged to grow down into that medium in search of water. So you're training your plants that that's where water is coming from. Remember, strong healthy roots is going to mean a strong healthy plant too. And inside every seed there's like a little energy bank, and it contains all the nutrition that's needed for that plant to germinate. But once that seed sprouts and they develop their first set of true leaves, so it's not the little baby leaves that you see to start with, but the next set of leaves, your baby seedlings are going to need a consistent supply of nutrients for healthy and vigorous growth. And if you're watering your seedlings, then you might want to look at doing a very weak fertilizer. I like to use like a natural liquid fertilizer that I've made, or a very weak compost tea. And if you don't fancy doing like a DIY natural liquid fertilizer like comfrey tea or something, I get it, that stuff stinks. But you can then use like an OMRI listed organic seaweed fertilizer or a fish emulsion, like something that's going to help give your plants a boost. And that's when, we want to be thinking about potting on our seedlings too, right after they get that first set of true leaves. And, seed starting mixes don't usually contain additional nutrients to feed your seedlings, right? If you make your own, then yeah, maybe you've got some extra things in there. Like I mentioned, I add some worm castings to mine. But your plants are going to be needing to move to a bigger container at some point, right? If you got them in a seed module, they're going to need a bit more room to grow, because if you keep them in that seed module, then they're going to get cramped with the roots, and they're going to get what's known as root bound, and then they get stressed out, and stressed out seedlings don't grow very well, and they're more susceptible to diseases. So what we do is we basically move them into a bigger container, and this helps maintain their growth. And this is called potting on in England. And to basically pot on your seedlings, you're going to grab some potting soil mix. I like to look for things that are OMRI listed, things that are organic. I don't want to get confused and use one that's accidentally got, some dodgy fertilizer in it that I don't know about. But just as you do with the seed starting mix, pre-moisten it, you need to do the same thing with your potting mix, is adding a bit of water to it, because then your seedling is going to have an easier time getting settled into its new home. So what you want to do is you want to partially fill your new container, and then tamp that soil down gently. So you want to gently press out some of those air pockets, and then you want to carefully remove your seedling from the seed starting container. And you can use like an old fork, an old spoon, like a butter knife, something like that to help tease out the seedling. And just be really careful when you're moving that seedling to only hold those baby seedling leaves that they had when they first sprouted. Try to avoid holding the seedling by the stem, which can easily break. Just go nice and slow when it comes to potting on your seedlings. And then you want to put the seedling into your slightly bigger container. So something like a 3 or a 4 inch pot works great. Maybe you want to put it into a bigger pot. That's totally fine too. And then you just kind of fill the container with more of your potting soil, and then water your seedling well. And then you got to put it back under the light, and then they'll continue to grow. And you might find that you've got plenty of room for a little while in your seed starting tray. Like the minute that you see those set of true leaves doesn't necessarily mean that you have to pot everything on. You can leave them for a little bit. But if you've got more than one seedling that are germinating in a module, or you've got lots of seedlings growing super close together, and you might want to think about thinning out your seedlings, and that's where you're going to remove the weaker looking seedling so that the strongest seedlings got more room to grow. And it's a process known as thinning out, or to thin out your seedlings, and the easiest way to do it, especially if you're a new gardener, is to just snip the weaker seedling with scissors at soil level, and then just remove, take away that part that's been cut off so it doesn't, rot down or anything near your other seedlings. And it basically creates better airflow around the seedlings, which reduces diseases, and it helps to avoid overcrowding and tangled roots. As you get more experience, then you might want to think about, carefully teasing those multiple seedlings apart, carefully teasing out their roots and then potting those on individually. And that's cool too. That's totally fine. But if you're a new gardener, then, don't try pulling out the other seedling, because inevitably you end up pulling out everything and then neither seedling survives. So just snip that weaker seedling with scissors at soil level and call it good. Now, your seedlings have been very, nicely coddled and cared for inside. And if you were to transplant your seedlings straight outside, it can be really traumatic for your plants if it happens too abruptly. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens with that in a minute or two. But what we want to do is we want to really mimic life outdoors for our seedlings. And in the great outdoors, young plants have lots of things thrown at them to help develop a strong plant. Maybe they've got animals brushing past them, or the wind and the rain are falling on them and blowing around them, and that helps to develop strong roots and stems. And you can recreate these activities inside to help build strong and sturdy plants that are going to have a much better chance at thriving when it comes to transplanting outside. And there's a couple of things that we can do. We can put a fan in there, put it on low, and let it periodically blow over the plants, and that's going to help mimic the wind. And it can also help cut down on some disease issues too, which is great. You can also run your hand over leaves and tops of plants, or gently that's not even a word. Gently shake the tray to mimic the wind if no fan is available. And to mimic rain, you can use a spray bottle and mist your plants to mimic that rain falling down. You just need to be sure that if you're doing that, you let the surface of the soil dry out, and make sure that your plants are dry out before misting them again, because if you're misting them too much, you're going to have water on those seedlings, and that's going to encourage diseases to take hold. So we don't want to do that, but you can use it if you live in a drier climate as well. That kind of helps things get used to what the rain does, really. Now, I mentioned hardening, transplanting seeds can be quite traumatic, and to counteract that, we do a process called hardening off. And if you transplant something straight outside after it's been very lovingly grown at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, it can cause transplant shock, and this is where plants die because just of the change of temperature and the elements outside. It just can't hack it, basically. Or plants can take 4 to 6 weeks to recover from it, which before they really get growing again. So if you think about that in terms of growing, that's a 4 to 6 week delay in you getting a harvest. And stressed out plants are way more likely to be targeted by pests and diseases. So do like the Raconteurs song and go steady as she goes when it comes to transplanting, right? Don't be hasty, Master Baggins, right? Just kind of slow things down a little bit. We want to harden off our plants. And the way that we do this is by gradually exposing our seedlings to life outside and acclimatizing them to temperature changes and the elements. And we typically do this over 10 days. And I know you might be thinking, that's 10 days. That's a long time. But it's so worth it. And I promise you it's worth it when your plants settle in and thrive and go off like the clappers growing, rather than keeling over and dying or taking more than a month to recover, right? It is definitely worth it. And one of the tools that is going to really help you with that is a cold frame. And cold frames don't need to be, expensive. And I will put a link in the show notes to some cheap and cheerful cold frames that you can make out of stuff that you might already have kicking about in your backyard. But what we do when it comes to hardening off is you want to choose a spot in your garden where it's not in direct sunlight, because direct sunlight's going to be way too much for your seedlings to take. We don't want to fry them here. We just want them to get used to going outside. So put them somewhere where it isn't in direct sunlight, but it also needs to be somewhere where your seedlings are not going to be battered by prevailing winds, right? So just think somewhere nice and sheltered, okay? That's why I like a cold frame, because the sides are going to provide some level of shelter and protection from the wind and the elements. And if it's super cold, you can close the lid on it too. So you want to take your plants out to the sheltered area for 2 hours on the first day. And then you want to bring them back inside by mid to late afternoon. Okay, you don't want to be leaving them outside. And then you want to do this each day and increase the time that they're outside by 1 to 2 hours each day. And by day 6, you want to be maybe thinking about leaving them outside, but covering them during the night. And that's why a cold frame's great for doing that, because you can just shut the lid, and the lid's going to act as, a barrier from frost. So it's going to allow it to acclimate to the temperatures, during the night, which are often a lot colder than during the day. And really don't skimp on the time that it takes to properly harden off your plants. If you just go straight out and shove your plants outside without doing this step, then you're going to be paying for it in the long run. Okay, so take it slow, get them used to being outside. And by day 6, if you're doing the piece where you're, putting it in the cold frame, you're closing the lid at night, you're opening it up the next day, and by day 8 or day 9 you could actually take them out of that cold frame and then just kind of leave them in that sheltered spot, so they kind of get used to not having that cover overnight. And one thing I will say about that is really make sure that you read the back of your seed packet to make sure that you're going to be doing the hardening off process at the right time. So you don't want to be trying to do the hardening off process for your hot weather crops like peppers, okra, tomatoes and stuff if it's still cold outside and they're going to freeze, right? We don't want to be doing that, because that's going to stress those plants out, and all the work that we've done beforehand is just going to be totally negated. If you're still if it's still within your expected frost timings, then, stick with those cool weather hardy crops like your brassicas, spinach, those kind of things. And, check out what your seed packet says. So cabbage, I can be transplanting out 3 weeks before the last frost date. I still need to do that hardening off process, and I can plant it out before the last frost date. In general, warm weather crops like okra, melons, peppers, squash, they need to be transplanted 2 weeks after the last frost date, because they don't do well when there's cold. They don't do well at all. They will die. You might get 1 or 2 that survive, but let's not risk it. You can start that hardening off process at that last frost date. So when, like, for example, my last frost date is the 10th of May, I will start hardening them off after the 10th of May. And then by the time like 2 weeks has passed, oh, my plants are totally ready to be going in the ground and they're hardened off. So they're going to be planted and they are going to be, boom, we got this. And they're going to grow like crazy. So really don't skimp on the hardening off. And pay attention to your frost dates, because that's what's going to help you take from, growing your seeds inside to the next level. And you're going to be way ahead of people that are buying transplants from the nursery and from the big box stores, because your plants are acclimated and they got this. And one of the other tips that I want to share before I finish off this this mini training today is that, to really help reduce any unnecessary stress on your plant the seedlings in their final growing space on a calm and overcast day, because if you're doing it on a super sunny day, things are going to dry out really quickly, and that's going to really stress out your seedlings when they're being transplanted. So if you do it on a calm and overcast day, they're not going to dry out as quick and they're going to get settled in so much quicker. And if you follow these steps, then you're going to be well on your way to a thriving organic garden this season. And I hope you found this training useful. If you love to hear more content like this, then let me know. And if you want to learn more with me, then make sure you sign up to the Grow Your Own Food Academy notification, because that bad boy is going to be going live pretty soon, and we're going to be talking all about how to grow your garden step by step over my shoulder throughout this season. Until next time, I hope that your garden grows beautifully and that you guys have a wonderful week. I'll catch you next Sunday.